Hello, my name's Aaron Quigley, and I'm a professor of computer science in the School of Computer Science here in the University of St Andrews. And I'm sorry I cannot be with you tonight, but I want to record this short video to introduce myself and also some of my research. As I said, I've been in St Andrews since 2010, and at the moment I'm also the director of what's called the Scottish Informatics and Computer Science Alliance. And this is an SFC-funded research pool that connects 14 universities, over 700 academics and 800 PhD students across Scotland. In addition to that, I'm also the ACM SIGCHI Vice President for Conferences, but I'm outgoing from that role because I'm becoming the new ACM CHI 2021 co-chair in Yokohama. That's a very large conference. Nearly 4,000 people attend that conference, and there might be many more when we actually run the conference in Yokohama. And within the university, I'm also an LGBTIQ plus role model, which is why I was delighted to be invited. And I am sorry that I can't be with you tonight because I did want to meet lots of you. But I guess one question to think about is how did I get to this point in my career that I'm a professor here in St Andrews? I'm Irish, so I began, as you can see in the bottom left here, as an undergraduate student in Trinity College in Dublin, and I entered in 1991. And the little colored circle that you see beneath the logo of the university tells you how many people would have known at that time that I was a gay student. And it would have been very, very few at that time. I wasn't out. Ireland at that time, homosexuality was only decriminalized in 1993. So it was actually illegal to be gay for the first couple of years that I was in college. So you wouldn't have been readily talking to people. But as you can see through this visualization, I moved from there to Australia to do a PhD. In between that, I'd worked in Japan as a teacher. Then I moved to the University of Sydney, came back to Ireland to work as a college lecturer in University College Dublin, moved to Tasmania as an associate professor before coming here. But in parallel to that, I also worked in industry, summer jobs in Maricel, and during my PhD in semantic designs in Texas, going back to work in Boston with Mitsubishi Electric Research Labs for a period of time, going to work and getting funded projects with NICTA and the Smart Internet CRC in Australia, being a visiting scientist with IBM in Dublin, becoming the director of the HIT Lab in Australia when I was also an associate professor in Tasmania, and again coming here now to St Andrews. So of course, along this way, what this doesn't actually show you, the arc of my career, it doesn't sort of show you the fact that when I got to Australia, that's where I met my now husband, Bradley Herbert. We were both he was an undergraduate student and I was a PhD student, and we met 22 years ago. But of course, prior to that, I'd been in Ireland, and then I'd been in Japan, and I'd been in various places. So when I first started, I basically became interested in information visualization. So that's now one of my three research areas that I continue to work on, along with ubiquitous computing and novel interfaces. Um, Computer science has a very long and distinguished and interesting history. If we actually look within the university itself, the King James Library was set up in 1612. And the year after that was the very first time that the word computer was used in a publication, in a book called The Young Man's Gleanings by R.B. Kent in 1613. And the term first referred to a person who completed calculations. So the term and the idea of computing goes back quite a long way. So when I look at my career and I look at my involvement in the field of computing, I situate myself more with respect to this sort of picture of what's gone on in the last sort of 30 or 40 years. You know, we had the birth of interactive graphical computing, personal computing, mobile computing, ubiquitous computing, and basically where we are today. So along the way, I've done lots of different pieces of work. I've worked on information visualization, that's taking abstract data and turning it into a visual form. I've also worked on novel interfaces, so that's taking combinations of, some off-the-shelf technology, some new hardware, some new software, combining it together to solve a problem in a new way, along with this idea of what's called ubiquitous computing, where basically the computation becomes part of the fabric of life, and then you just can use the computation if, when, and where you actually are interested in making use of that computation. So let me just give you 4 or 5 examples within the time that I've got left to show you. And I'll pick one, which is to begin with in the University of Newcastle. And I use this as an example because in my office here where I am, I still actually have the proceedings of the very first workshop that I actually attended. And what's interesting for me when I look back on this paper is that, first of all, my supervisor made me write it in a very small amount of time. And also, it basically brought me to Adelaide to present the work within two or 3 months of actually starting my PhD. But I actually traveled to Adelaide with Bradley, who is now my husband. We met just a few days after I started my PhD. We got to know each other, and then when my supervisor, when I had this paper accepted, my supervisor, he said, like, "Oh, you should go and present this piece of work." And of course, I wanted to, and I asked, "Well, could I, instead of flying, could I use the money and travel and drive there?" And he said yes, so I did. And then myself and Brad took a road trip together, our first road trip together. So Brad was with me when I was presenting it, but of course, as is the case today with many of the conferences I go to, he doesn't come to hear me talk because he's not a computer scientist. And while he loves me, he doesn't necessarily want to come and listen to me talking about the work. Um, this was my first paper, and then a couple of years later, I was actually the editor of the 1999 version of this, which I still have in my office to this day. So visualization is something that I've continued to be interested in. When I ended up finishing my PhD, which I also have in my office, as you can see, a few years later, 4 years after I met Brad, and 4 years after I got to Australia, the dedication at the end of my thesis, well, the acknowledgement or the dedication was to my parents, but the very final line said, "For their love and inspiration, which has guided me through every crucial stage in my life, I would like to thank my parents who are gone but never forgotten. I know you were watching over me. Finally, I would like to express my love and eternal devotion to my friends, family, and Brad. You complete me." Um, a very cheesy line, I admit. I believe that when we were dating at the very beginning, Jerry Maguire was a very popular movie that we possibly had seen. So that expression had stuck in my mind. So after I'd worked in Boston and Brad came to join me, and an interesting point there is that he got on a plane days after 9/11 and still joined me in America, and we stayed there. And and then we decided to come back to Australia, even though he'd been accepted to Harvard and been offered a permanent position. And my boss there in America was willing to try to help us, even though there was zero recognition. There was no gay rights. There was no recognition of same-sex couples. There was nothing that we could do, even though I had a green card that wasn't going to help him stay. So we decided to come back to Australia. And then I started working on this work that you see here, the SharePick, which was a diamond touch system that I'd taken with me from Mitsubishi. And you can see here the people are touching and interacting with the system. They're using gestures to control the interaction. And what we did is here we studied this. And then, of course, we got publications, but we were also studying how people might use other novel forms of interaction, let's say pen and paper, to actually design new interfaces where you actually draw on the paper, you draw the interface that you actually want to use rather than using a pre-built computer screen. And this was all in the time when I was in Australia. And then by the time we moved to Ireland was when I started getting some of this work published, as you can see here again. So by the time I got to Ireland, of course, coming into Ireland was difficult because, homosexuality had only been decriminalized at that stage 11 years previously. But of course, there was no recognition for same-sex couples. So as you can see here, here's an article that we had published in the Irish Independent, which showed that we had to keep our bills for 7 years to prove that we were an established couple. Um, I'd encourage you to have a look at the article. One of the points, one of the things I said in it was, it's a typical evening in for Aaron Quigley and Bradley Herbert. After arriving home from work, they'll prepare a gay dinner. They'll sit down and watch some gay TV. Their gay Christmas tree twinkles gaily in their gay living room. It's a riotous, hedonistic existence, a mad camp world of pleasure and excess. Everyone knows this is how homosexual couples live. Aaron enjoys a good chuckle as he rattles off the parody. The reality, of course, is much more mundane. After a busy day at the office, a gay dinner is much the same as any other dinner, and a gay TV watching is remarkably similar to the heterosexual kind. You still do the same kind of things when you get home, no matter what your sexual orientation. And I said, then, we're no different than any happily straight married couple, says Aaron. However, at the time, Brad had no rights to stay. We had to appeal to the government, we had to appeal to the Minister for Justice, and we had to get a special dispensation back in 2005 to allow us to have Brad stay with me and to allow him to continue to work. And we were one of the first couples, actually, we were the first couple to get permission for both of us to be able to stay and both of us to be able to stay and work, and which we did happily. And with great support and help from the Immigration Council of Ireland, who helped us make a case to the minister. And of course, 10 years later, not only could we stay, Ireland became one of the first countries in the world to bring in, through a public vote, um, same-sex marriage for couples like us. So if we'd only waited a decade, we wouldn't have actually had to go and beg the government to allow him to stay. Anyway, it's working on this multi-fidelity interaction that you can see here, which is displays on and around the body. So the idea here is to combine head-mounted displays along with, other types of displays, things that you might have in your hand, things that you might have on your watch. And this research that I did then continues to this day. So at the moment now, I have a couple of PhD students who are working on developing new technologies for systems that might look like this. So of course, it won't look like this in the future. I mean, as cool as it looks now, it won't look like this in the future. You'll have a much more miniaturized version of it. But the idea is I can see content in front of me, and I can also see content here, and I can see content here. And the idea could be, could I combine them all together to get a multi-fidelity interaction? So I can see some pixels on this, I can see some pixels in here, and I can basically combine the two displays together to give me this big multiple viewed interaction space. So we continue doing this type of work even to this day, this type of multi-fidelity interaction. Now, the last thing I will point out is Brad, my husband, is a very kind man who doesn't mind me including him as a model sometimes in some of my papers. This is a paper that we had published last year at the CHI conference, and this my model that you can see here is Bradley. And what we were studying in this work was change blindness, and whether or not we could take advantage of the fact that we know the proximity between the display and your face can change. We can adapt the interface, and we can also take advantage of the knowledge of change blindness to adapt the interface. So if you look at this video, you'll actually see the person moving the display backwards and forwards, and there's a change occurring. And the question I would ask is, do you see that change? Do you notice that change? And if you don't, that's an opportunity for us to take advantage of that and adapt the display accordingly, which is what we did. One of the last bits of research, which is I just want to kind of briefly touch on, is this work that is a nice example of what we have here in St. Andrews, where we have a couple of undergraduate students who are involved in this project, a PhD student, a postdoc, and myself, and all together, along with hardware that we had donated from Google as part of their ATAP program, we were able to invent this new type of technology called RadarCat, which is radar categorization. And in this video, you can actually see RadarCat doing object recognition, which means, of course, we can then start recognizing objects, we can start detecting them, we can start understanding that as part of the human-computer interaction that we actually want. One of our recent papers that was published just last month in London was exploring tangible interactions with radar sensing. Here it's a combination of three areas: miniature radar, tangible user interfaces, and then counting. And as you can see in this video, the cards are being counted one by one. There's many pieces of research that are contributing to this. There's a knowledge and work from physics. There's knowledge and understanding of the characteristics of radar. There's also the idea that how would we actually translate this into new ways of interacting with a computer. So that's it. That's my brief introduction, a little bit longer than I promised, but I hope you get a flavor for what I do and how my research and life as a person who happens to be gay has intersected. This is me. This is a picture of me giving a talk recently, a keynote, closing keynote at a conference in China. And Bradley featured in it because he's, as I said, he's a model. And I just want to remind people because other people, when they're giving their talks, mention their friends and family and other people. And Brad's my family. So I put him up, the picture here of us hiking up the Great Wall of China the day before I gave the keynote, the closing keynote at this conference. So if you're more interested in me and want to know more about the research that I do, you can go to www.aaronquigley.org. You can also just go to the university's computer science webpage. So thank you very much. I hope you all enjoy the evening. Bye-bye now.